In 1897, an Italian economist was studying land ownership patterns in his country. His name was Vilfredo Pareto, and what he found was something so strange, so counterintuitive, so inconsistent with how people believe the world is supposed to work, that when he showed it to colleagues, most of them didn't know what to do with it. 20% of the population owned 80% of the land. He checked the numbers, then checked them again. Then, almost out of curiosity, looked at his garden. 20% of the pea pods were producing 80% of the peas. He started looking everywhere. At business, at economics, at nature, at how effort translated into output, in system after system after system. And everywhere he looked, the same pattern appeared. A small minority of inputs, producing an overwhelming majority of results. He didn't know what to call it. He didn't know how deep it went. He simply wrote it down, and for 50 years it sat, largely unnoticed, in academic journals. Until a management consultant named Richard Koch picked it up, spent years studying it, and realized it was not just an observation about 19th century Italian land ownership. It was one of the most important truths about how the world actually works, and almost nobody was using it. The book he wrote about it is called The 80-20 Principle, and it is going to change the way you see your work, your time, your relationships, and your results. Before this video is over, let's break it. Section 1. The principle that changes everything. Here is the core idea, simple to state and difficult to truly absorb. In almost any system you examine, 80% of the results come from 20% of the causes. 20% of your customers generate 80% of your revenue. 20% of your work produces 80% of your meaningful output. 20% of the roads in a city carry 80% of the traffic. 20% of the features in a software product are used 80% of the time. 20% of your habits and behaviors are responsible for 80% of your happiness, health, and success. Now the numbers are not always precisely 80 and 20. Sometimes it is 90-10, sometimes 70-30. The principle is not about the specific numbers. It is about the fundamental imbalance between inputs and outputs. The fact that causes and results are never distributed equally, and that a small number of things are always doing the vast majority of the work. Koch's argument is both the observation and the provocation. If 20% of your efforts are producing 80% of your results, what are you doing with the other 80% of your time? That question should sit uncomfortably, because the honest answer for most people is that the other 80% of their time is producing 20% of their results, while consuming 80% of their energy, their attention, and their life. That is not a time management problem. That is a focus problem. And the 80-20 principle is the lens that makes the focus visible for the first time. Section 2. Why we ignore the principle by default. Here's what makes this principle genuinely difficult to apply, and why most people, even those who know about it, never fully use it. We are wired to believe that inputs and outputs should be proportional. Work 10 hours, produce 10 hours of results. Have 10 clients, generate 10 client relationships worth maintaining. Learn 10 skills, be equally good at all 10. This is what Koch calls the 50-50 fallacy, the assumption that effort and outcome are roughly balanced. That the world is essentially fair in how it distributes return on effort. It is not, and it never has been. But the fallacy runs deep, because it is embedded in almost every system we have built as a society. The 8-hour working day assumes that all 8 hours are equally productive. They are not. For most people, 2 of those hours produce more than the other 6 combined. The school curriculum assumes every subject deserves equal attention. It doesn't. A student who excels at 3 things and is average at 7, will almost always outperform. The student who is moderately good at all 10 performance reviews that reward activity, over impact meetings that treat every agenda item as equally important, to-do lists that give the same visual weight to a task that will change everything, and a task that changes nothing. Every one of these systems is built on the 50-50 fallacy. And until you see it clearly, until you accept that the world is fundamentally, irreversibly imbalanced, you cannot begin to use that imbalance in your favor. Section 3. How to apply the 80-20 principle. This is where the book becomes a practical weapon. Koch gives you the lens. Here is how to use it. In your work, start with the question Koch considers the most valuable in any professional context. Which 20% of my activities are producing 80% of my results? Not which activities feel important, not which ones fill most of my time, not which ones have always been done this way, which ones are actually moving the needle. The answer almost always surprises people, because the highest leverage activities are rarely the ones that feel most urgent. They are usually the ones that are easiest to postpone. The strategic conversation, the key relationship, the focused creative work that requires a clear morning and never gets one because the inbox arrived first. Koch's prescription: identify your 20% ruthlessly, protect it ferociously, and look honestly at the 80% of activity that is producing marginal results, and ask whether it needs to be done at all, done by you or done at this frequency in your business. If you run any kind of business or independent income, this application is immediately valuable. 20% of your customers almost certainly generate 80% of your revenue, but those same customers are rarely the ones receiving 20% of your attention. Koch argues that the 80-20 analysis of a customer base is one of the most reliably profitable exercises any business can run, because it almost always reveals that the business is subsidizing its low-value relationships with the energy it should be directing toward its highest value ones. Fire the 80%, not necessarily, but understand them clearly. Know the cost of serving them, and never let them consume the resource that belongs to the 20% who are actually building the business. In your time, this is the application Koch considers the most personally transformative. He introduces a framework he calls 80-20 time analysis, a simple but confronting audit of how your hours actually distribute across the week, not how you think they distribute, how they actually do. When you track this honestly, for even a single week, most people discover that the moments of highest productivity, deepest focus, greatest creative output, and clearest thinking cluster into a surprisingly small window: 2 hours in the morning, a specific environment, a particular kind of task, and the rest of the time is maintenance, distraction, low-grade busyness, and the performance of productivity, rather than the thing itself. Koch's argument: if you can identify your 20% of time, the window when you are genuinely operating at your highest level, and protect that window as the non-negotiable centerpiece of your working day, the results compound dramatically, not because you worked more, because you stopped diluting your best hours with work that could have waited. In your relationships, this is the most personal application, and the one that takes the most courage to act on. Koch does not say this lightly. 20% of your relationships provide 80% of your fulfillment, support, growth, and joy. And the inverse is equally true. A small number of relationships consume a disproportionate amount of your emotional energy, while giving very little back. He is not prescribing ruthlessness. He is prescribing honesty. The relationships that energize you, challenge you, see you clearly, and make you more of who you're trying to become, those deserve more of your finite time and attention. than they are probably currently receiving. The ones that drain without replenishing deserve an honest look at the cost of continuing at the current level. Section 4. The reframe that changes everything. Here is the idea from this book I want you to carry beyond this video. Koch makes a distinction that most goal-setting advice completely misses. He separates two ways of pursuing a result. The first way, the conventional way, is what he calls linear thinking. Set a goal, apply effort proportional to the goal, work harder when progress is slow, push through, stay consistent across all fronts. The second way is 80-20 thinking. Find the 20% of inputs. That will produce 80% of the result. Apply leverage their disproportionate focus, disproportionate energy, disproportionate investment. Deliberately neglect the rest. Most people have been taught that this second approach is lazy, that you can't ignore the 80%, that every area deserves attention. That success is about consistency across everything. Koch's counter-argument is backed by over a century of evidence across every field. The people who produce the most extraordinary results are almost never the ones working the hardest across everything. They are the ones who have found their 20%, the leverage point, the high-return activity, the relationship or skill or idea that has a disproportionate impact on the outcome, and who have organized their entire life around doing more of that and significantly less of everything else. This is not a shortcut. It is the opposite of a shortcut. It requires the clarity to identify what actually matters, the courage to stop doing what doesn't, and the discipline to protect the 20% from the 80% that is always louder, always more urgent, and always easier to say yes to. The 80% will fill your life. If you let it, the 20% will change it, if you choose it. So here is the pattern this book is asking you to break. The pattern of equal effort across everything. Of treating every task, every relationship, every hour of your day as though it deserves the same amount of you. It doesn't. And deep down you already know that. You know which conversations move you forward, and which ones circle the same ground. You know which hour of your morning produces something real, and which part of your afternoon disappears into tasks that felt important and changed nothing. You know, you just haven't given yourself permission to act on what you know. Richard Koch's message is not complex. Find your 20%. Protect it like it's the most valuable thing you have, because it is. And stop apologizing for the clarity it takes to say no to the 80. The goal is not to do more. The goal is to do more of what matters. Less, but better. And if that idea lands somewhere real for you, if it shifts something, confirms something, or challenges something you've been carrying, I'd love to know. Drop it in the comments. Tell me, what is the 20% of your life that is producing most of your results? And what is the 80% you already know you should be letting go of? These are the conversations that make this channel worth coming back to. And your answer might be exactly what someone else watching this video needed to read. If this breakdown gave you something worth keeping, give it a like. It helps more people find this content, and the kind of person who watches a video like this is exactly the kind of person more people need to be watching. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Every week we break down the books and ideas that help you think at a different level. And the next one is already coming. Think differently. Live intentionally. I'll see you in the next one.